Ladies and gentlemen, here we are again, another interesting session as part of the AGS digital event. I'm joined for this session by Fabio Gamba. And Fabio, welcome on board, sir.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Now, Fabio, you're managing two associations. So one known as ACA, which is the Airline Catering Association, and the other one, ASA, which is the Airport Services Association. So just to get everybody warmed up, can I just ask you just for a little bit of background as to what you have to do, what you like to do, and what you do?
Well, first of all, it's an interesting situation to be in, to try, I must say, to lead two associations at the same time. That was an interesting moment when that happens. But yes, I mean, indeed, with the two associations, my role is pretty much the same. I'm the managing director or the director general. Actually, the titles are slightly different, but the reality behind them are similar. With one caveat, though, the ASA, the Ground Handling Association, is having a much longer history than ACA, which was created basically 2.5 years ago. So it's still a fledgling association with just a small number of members, the founding members, as we call them. That was decided, back in 2017. Basically, the two associations are looking at doing the same, which is to represent the interests of their members, mostly vis-a-vis the governments, the authorities, vis-a-vis the airlines, their customers. The customers are the same, the airline in the two situations, and the airports, I would say. So it's interesting to see that, ACA can take advantage of the knowledge and the expertise and the visibility of ASA, but also somehow vice versa, I would say. So interesting situation.
Yeah, no, very good. Yeah, and you obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but ASA sort of developed from the IAHA days back when they started in '74, and I can remember I was invited to give a presentation. I think when John Willis was there.
Okay.
So it's
so indeed, IAHA was stopped in 2011, and it became ASA. So ASA is 9-year-old, but it has, been before that in the 1970s, indeed, IAHA ever since. So long history.
Yeah. No, exactly, and a well worthwhile program. Yeah. Now, obviously, terrible times affecting everybody. How has that experience materialized for you as the as the head of these two organizations over the last 6 to 7 months?
Well, I think if you allow me, I'll sort of take off a hat and speak more with respect to or on behalf of ASA, because otherwise it's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
Right. But with respect to the ground handling industry, I mean, it's obviously we've been hard hit, but that's no secret to anyone. The whole sector is really in a dire strait and in a grim situation. It's always amazing to see the difference between, or the gap between, if you will, the strategic importance of ground handling to the whole ecosystem on the one side, and the fact that we are a labor-intensive job with thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Actually, worldwide, we're talking about 750 to 800,000 people working for ground handling. So, kind of important numbers, and the little consideration that these people have, and the little consideration that people in general have for this job, which is largely overlooked. And when you look at the fact that they've had to be every day, every night on the tarmac, without sometimes the possibility to respect social distancing imposed by governments, it speaks volumes of still how far we are from us being able to value ourselves and to introduce and to present ourselves to the governments as strategic elements of the whole ecosystem. So no one questions the fact that air transport is strategic, and that airlines and airports have to be supported by the governments. And you've seen here and there a number of measures taken by governments. I read in the press lately that there had been up to $140 billion injected by states throughout the world for ailing airlines, and just 1 or 2%, literally nothing of that has trickled down to contractors and to ground handlers in particular. And so this gap between the reality and how then we're being supported by authorities or not supported by authorities is quite obvious and shocking.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And people, when people look at an industry or a series of organisations that they're not 100% familiar with, even though they experience it themselves by flying in and out of countries for holidays or business, etc. It's a shame that the practical side isn't trickled down. It always starts at the top and then it loses out as it goes down. And actually, the real practical work takes place at the floor, at the bottom level. So it's a shame. Hopefully, as a result of the importance of cargo, which has become ever more prominent and justifiable in my mind, everybody's starting to realise how important it is with supply chain. And you mentioned something there about individuals not being able to exercise social distancing as directed, but it goes great ways to show how safe the airports and handlers have managed things with the mitigation actions that take place, and especially with the guys who are loading passenger aircraft known as freighters. I mean, that's been exceptional from your members. So I'm sure you got a few words on that, Fabio.
Yes, indeed. But there are a number of things that you're raising here. First and foremost, I think it's important to remind the auditors that this business has lost more than 50% of its people.
Yeah.
Right. So of the 750 to 800,000 people I was mentioning before, we're down to less than 50% of that now. So some of these people have had the chance of benefiting from some job retention schemes in place in different countries. We all know of Europe, in the UK, the job retention scheme, or whatever it's called. And you have the likes in continental Europe. In the US, you have the CARES Act. And other countries, you have other things. But these measures are only valid for a period of time.
Yeah.
And they were all crafted for ending by sometime around September this year, so a month ago. And that was the plan until relatively recently, because things were supposed to improve, right? But as of September, immediately after this slight rebound of, say, July, August, when it became clear that things were not going in the right direction, I think a lot of questions were asked by ourselves vis-a-vis our authorities to say, are you going to prolong or to extend these schemes or these aids? And the response has been relatively mixed so far. So I think that's the first thing that I wanted to say with respect to the people that work in this industry, and for which I want to pay big tribute. The second point is the airports and how resilient, if you will, this relatively closed loop system has been vis-a-vis the virus. And it's true that one of our major targets in this crisis has been to try and talk to the public, which we normally don't do. We're typically a B2B business, to try and explain to the people that it's safe to travel.
Yeah.
And together with other associations, our friends and colleagues from the airports themselves, from ACI and from IATA and the regional associations, this has been one of our primary targets, to try and explain to the people that flying is safe, right? With HEPA filters on board, with the food that you're eating. And here now I'm changing my hat again. We've come up with guidance documents with respect to the food and how the food is prepared, and the fact that food cannot be a vehicle for the virus. So that would alleviate a number of concerns, legitimate concerns, from the traveling public. And to try and restore this confidence that people had gradually lost with respect to traveling. And that's an important aspect because, you can see ripple effects of, measures taken by governments, announcements that are, grim in the press. And then people afraid of thinking, well, am I going to travel for my holidays or even for work? And then people not traveling anymore. And then you can see that this has, is having, as you said, ripple effects on the whole value chain. So one of the things that we really wanted to do with, ASA and the various associations was to try and alleviate these concerns as much as possible to the traveling public. And now back to your point, and I'm sorry if I made a little digression.
No, I'm glad you've navigated through the multi-tiered question.
You're thinking, what is best in order to, restore the confidence back to passengers? What is best? Is it to, organize testing sessions at the entrance of the airport so that whenever you are within the airport, you are supposed to be, yourself free of virus and in a free virus environments? Or is it to impose testing once you've flown and possibly then being brought to quarantine, as some states have done, like in the UK, for instance, back in July, August, and other countries? And this is not an easy question, but what I can see now more and more as things unfold, and unfortunately the virus unravels, is that we are seeing that quarantine measures do not work. They do not work because it's almost nigh on impossible for governments to enforce them. However, what could work is to try and test people. So precisely back at the example of being tested at the entrance of the airport, if you have a testing system and a testing protocol that is not only functioning, but that is being organized in a common way. In other words, it's not one testing protocol in the UK and another testing protocol in Italy or in the US. If it's really commonly organized, that can definitely change a number of things and certainly bring back this passenger confidence. Now, I'm not saying that coming up with this, which we're working on, by the way, would overnight change the situation. There's still the open questions of when I'm flying to the other country, what will I be able to do? Are the restaurants and the hotels and the bars and the cafes and the museums open? If not, why am I going there? But in terms of epidemiology and in terms of testing, I think we're getting there, and that is certainly, and I'd like to pride ourselves as being, at the origin of really pushing that strongly to the authorities, the testing.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I just think, and you mentioned there about, you've mentioned airports, you've mentioned testing, you've mentioned confidence, you've mentioned quarantine. For me, and I've traveled a few times during the period, the one thing that surprises me and also frustrates me is the difference between airports. And for anybody who's flying, they're starting to hear positive things about once you're actually on the aircraft. So whether it's the HEPA system, whether it's the fact that 1 in 24 or 1 in 27 million people who have flown since the beginning of the year have actually contracted the illness on the aircraft. And now you're looking at how many hours you'd have to sit next to somebody with a mask on before you'd have any chance of contracting it. So all of these things are so positive. However, the other statistics that are being bandied around are that, the average touch points on a legacy carrier trip is anything from 500 to 700, and private aviation is 50 to 70. So people are concerned as to what happens with those 500 to 700 touch points. How can I be sure what happens from when I leave my front door, where I'm in control, to where I get on an aircraft, to where it's safe? And I think that's the consistency that the industry and all representative bodies needs to communicate and be 100% confident about. And even before COVID, you had one airport take your shoes off, one don't, one take your belt, your watch off, one don't, one your laptop out, one your laptop in. So people were very confused about why there's so many differences. So I think between the representative bodies and ACI and governments, that level of consistency needs to come in before anything else. And then obviously it's the testing before you get to the airport, so that when you get there, you've got a clear test result, maybe some spot testing at the airport, and then having corridors that accept the same testing. And then obviously we've got the next question then is about hub transfers, because then they would have to have a sort of a testing credible bubble, so that there was a different dynamic at the airport when you were transferring.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if that was really a question or a statement, but I would say the following: back to the basics. We need the passenger to come back to the airport, because that's the oil of the engine. Without the passengers, the whole ecosystem, falls down. It cracks. And in order to have the passenger back on board or back in the loop, we need him, the passenger, and her, to trust the system.
Yeah.
Right. And today there is a blend of untrust from the passenger, but also a lot of questions that no one can really answer. And the one that I mentioned, right? If I'm going to this country and I know that I'm being safe traveling to that country, but then if that country I can't do anything because everything's closed, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
This unfortunately is going beyond our realm of, what is it that we can do? So I think we're doing our utmost together, and it's not only an ASA or an ACA fight, because it would mean nothing, honestly. It is an ASA, ACA, IATA, A4E, A4A, ACI, what have you, retail companies, the regional airlines, what have you. All together, we are constantly on the back of not only the European Commission, which has only limited resources, as you know, on that, but of the authorities, to try and make sure that, and ICAO obviously, to try and make sure that there is some coordination at some point. So there is some consistency in the approach. More than this, I'm afraid it's going to be difficult. But I think what we can do, we're trying to do it.
Yeah. No, I understand. And again, it's clear that about the consistency. So now, instead of trying to have a panacea for the global industry, if we come down a few steps and we look at individual airports and whether or not those airports have got the opportunity now, or see it as an opportunity, to sort of be masters of their own ecosystem, to start to influence their tenants, their group of businesses, to say, look, we all have to do certain things in certain ways, and we have to follow nice, simple guidelines. So from clarity to competence to compliance to control. So 4 nice, simple steps. If that airport decided to do something like that, I think it makes a lot more sense, because airlines can fly in, they can fly out, and they can stay away. But the airport has to try and generate as much business for the group or the ecosystem as possible. Now, if that was to be the case, then you start looking at national consistency. So then every airport in each country should do it exactly the same way, because then that steps up and creates a national marketing, shall we say, ecosystem. Do you think there's an opportunity for that?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, and here I would rather talk about the European Union, where you have, by definition, by default, some coordination, right? It's not unlike a country where, in the US, for instance, where you have federal authority deciding all these matters. Here you have 27 countries plus, and they decide a number of measures, but they remain sovereign. Yeah, that's the first thing, right? So to your point, yes, there is a will to go down this avenue, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, but there are a lot of Chinese walls that the European Commission cannot overtake or overcome. simply because they are ingrained in the sovereignty of the nations. Plus, on top of that, I would say, unlike perhaps airlines, each and every airport has a different configuration,
Yeah.
and it's very difficult then to have a one set of common measures applied in a similar way. That being said, I think in terms of policy, that would already be a great step if all the airports, to start with in the European Union, but of course around the world, as said before, would agree on a common protocol for testing. That would already simplify things so much. So it's relatively simple, and you might ask, so why doesn't it happen? And we're back to square one with the role of the authorities in there. And the role of the authorities is not easy either. I mean, they have to consider a different level of epidemiology in, say, Sweden compared to Spain. With Spain, I was looking at the numbers this morning. Spain's numbers are really worrying. And of course, the response to the authorities vis-a-vis that cannot be perceived as being the same as in a country where the level of epidemiology is much lower.
Yeah.
So how do you cope with that? Right. So it's, I know, and I'm very well placed to say that. We like to hit the governments because they're not doing what they're supposed to do. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that, they're also extremely focused on trying to protect their people. And yes, indeed, we're always regretting the lack of absolute coordination amongst them. But at a point, even if we were able to have a coordinated testing protocol at airports, I still believe that we would be pretty low in the numbers of the flying public. I was looking at this morning again. I was looking at the Eurocontrol numbers. The seat load factor is less than 40%.
Yeah.
Okay. The general seat load factor for Europe and North America before the crisis was between 82 and 85%.
Yeah.
So it shows that not only you have much less flights, we're talking about we had around 40% of the capacity that we were last year. But on top of that, we are 50% below in terms of seat occupancy. And that speaks volumes. I mean, against that, there's not much you can do because there is a really gutsy feeling from the passenger that this is not a good time to travel.
Yeah, 100%. And like I said, I've done a couple of trips myself, but the thing that stands out is the ghost town, the eeriness. Food and beverage, retail, all closed. Very little things that you can facilitate when you're at the airport, and that gives everybody a sense again of fear and like as if they're watching a sci-fi movie. But I just feel that maybe we could communicate better, even once people get into those, the environment of the airport. Once you decide to think, maybe should I fly, when you're booking a ticket, that all of those touch points of communication, I don't think have been communicated well enough. And it's a great opportunity to sell or to make people aware of exactly what goes behind the scenes, because there's so many different initiatives that get reported on LinkedIn or various sites individually, but not as a collective of what's going on behind the scenes, from how toilets, how equipment, how baggage trolleys, how everything is being disinfected. And I just feel that we really need to come together and create something that is consistent everywhere, even if it's about the basics of hygiene. I think that would make a big difference.
You're right. I think we're all a bit overwhelmed by the reality of this pandemic. We've never been in such a situation for such a protracted period of time before. Of course, it's an industry that has cycles, and we all know how to cope with cycles whenever we can see one. And this industry is very resilient as well, precisely because of these cycles. But that's unheard of.
Yeah,
that's unheard of, and we're trying to chase the passengers, so that they come back And as a matter of fact, we are actually, as a matter of fact, focused on two things. One is precisely try and persuade the passenger that it is absolutely, safe to fly. And to be honest, I think he got the message. I think he got it. We can still do better in trying to communicate and this and that, but there's such a massive influx and flow of information that adding up to that flow, I think would have only limited effects. So I think this is somehow, I think we've gone as far as we could. Now, what I'm more concerned with is the resilience and the immediate future of this industry, of ground handling, of catering, and in general of the transport sector. Why? Because, with 50% of people out and with 50% of our expertise out, I'm afraid that whenever things will turn back to normal, now we don't expect that before any time between 23 and 24, there's going to be a lot of expertise, lost forever.
Yeah.
That we won't be able to recuperate. Of course, we can form new employees, and we will have to, and to train them, and so on and so forth. But normally, there is a normal passage of the baton between the older generation and the newer one, right? And this passage of the baton won't happen this time.
Yeah.
So I think really this industry needs to reinvent itself. And we can talk about that a bit more at length, but I honestly believe that we've passed a point where we really need to ask ourselves the right questions.
Yeah.
What is it that we need to look at? And I'm taking this example of the current situation of legislation for ground handling in the world.
Yeah.
It is striking, again, that everyone recognized ground handling as being an essential element or piece of the jigsaw within the overall ecosystem, and especially within the overall safety aspects, right? And yet, if you're looking at the current legislation in place, there's nothing. It's just like we can do whatever we feel.
Yeah.
And that in the US or in Brazil or in Russia or in Australia or in Europe, we do it the way that we feel is right for us to do it. And so there are a number of things that drive our business. These things are, cutthroat competition, race to the bottom, profitability, market share, SLAs, very punitive SLAs, this type of things. And I'm thinking, we can cope with that as long as business is normal, or whether there is a growing trend within the business. But we can definitely not cope with that anymore when there is a halt like the one that we're in at this stage. And I think we ought to take the time to really rethink and reboot this process, because we've been constantly sawing the branch on which we're sitting.
Yes, that's a good one.
This race to the bottom is killing the margins of this industry. This industry has literally no margin at all. The only way for this industry to continue to be able to operate is to defragment and is to consolidate.
Yeah.
But consolidation can go up to a certain point because there's only one direction that consolidation go, right? And once you've consolidated, what happens? And so I fundamentally believe that, and this is one of the things that we're trying to do now, especially in the European Union, which seems to be more alert to these questions, which is to say, hey guys, there's only one piece of legislation that exists today in Europe, which is Directive 9667 EC, which is the directive on market access. And it looks like the only way to look at this from a legislation point of view, to ground handling, is from a competition perspective. And I'm thinking, well, that's an important one, absolutely. But that seems to me that there are a number of missing aspects. Safety. Why isn't there anything on safety?
Yep.
There should be a single standard. It may be a minimum standard, it may be a best practice, whatever. But
Yep.
that should be an acceptable thing out there. Now, you will tell me, yes, there are indeed industry standards. We're working together with IATA, in the IGOM, the ISAGO, and the AHM, all these things, very well. But they are not enforceable by the member state. And hence, you agree with them or you disagree, you implement them or you don't implement them. That doesn't change anything. And at the end of the day, what matters is to get the contract. As simple as that. And what matters is at what price you can get the contract. And so, of course, the lower price, the more chances you get, you will have to get the contract. And again, I think there should be the minimum standard imposed. And this is something that we're working, and I'm sorry if I'm digressing, but I feel really about this. This is something that we are really now pushing with the airlines and the airports. The airports are absolutely key in that elements, so that by next year or the year after, we have this goddamn minimum standards and quality and safety and training of people and recognition of that training and this type of things, which is lacking.
100% agree with you. And I think what you said there, businesses now got such a shock with everything being just in time. Now people are starting to look at just in case. And from the just in time, they weren't looking at business continuity and sustainability. And that now they have to do, and they have to be very, very careful with it. So I 100% agree that as part of that continuity and sustainability, it shouldn't just be on competition. It should be on continuity, sustainability, safety and security. There should be customer impact, and there should also be competency of employees. And if all of those things were in place, then as an industry, we're proving that we're caring. But as you said before, even with IGOM, you've only got to look at the number of bloody cones that everybody can't even agree on an aircraft, which is ridiculous. So there tends to be the focus on the recommended levels. And there's two levels above that. There's important and there's critical. And I think now we should start focusing on the critical areas. Then you look at the important ones and then the recommended. So if the critical is addressed, the trickle down has a more solid effect on the whole industry. So I totally agree with what you're saying there. And what I'd like to ask you now is on the competency side, the fact that so many people have been displaced, they actually are the people that are laying down the foundation for the success of the industry of the future. And it's a little bit like, during wartime, lest we forget. We shouldn't forget those people that have had so many hours of training pumped into them and the levels of experience. And if they do get a chance in a different industry, those industries will be the ones who will benefit because they'll have seen what you get from people that are trained so well and they understand a regulated environment. But I think it's so important that we keep in touch with all of those people so that if they do decide to come back, and please God, they'll return to the industry family they love, that they don't feel neglected or alienated or behind. So I know you're doing a special training platform for members. One of the things that I'm trying to get people to get behind is keeping in contact with people who've been displaced through no fault of their own. And for as long as they want to come back into the industry, we should keep in touch with them and keep communicating and allow them to have access to the same sorts of training that we give to our own people or our own membership, so that when they do get the chance to come back, it's not like being a newbie again or the new person on the block. And I think that level of care from this crisis is hopefully where the industry and other industries are going to go. Do you agree with that?
I would not only agree with that, but I would say, there are a couple of encouraging news on that front. And again, I'm referring mostly about the European Union or Europe in general. As you may know, we managed to convince, after some years, EASA, which is the safety agency in Europe, to start doing some work on the safety aspects and the training aspects to ground handling personnel. And had started actually working on this 2 years ago.
Yeah.
For a rule-making task, right? And unfortunately, for undisclosed reasons, really, the EASA decided to pause its work back in May this year, allegedly for COVID-19 reasons. And we were pretty adamant and vocal about the fact that, we told basically EASA, well, that is precisely in these moments that we should continue this work, because it's obviously important throughout, but in these crisis moments, this is where we would see that this could make a difference for these people who will be jobless.
Yep.
And if they can be recognized for the training that they have been going through, then they would be hired in a much, let's say, I wouldn't say easy, because we're still at a fraction of the traffic that we used to be, but at least they have something that they can avail themselves of. They can, they can justify, and that they can show to potential future employers. So the good news, or the let's say the positive news, is that EASA has agreed to resume the work.
Very good. Very good.
I don't have a date yet, but I've been told by EASA, senior officials, that it would resume before the end of the first semester, so sometime in April, May, and we're going to be there with all our means, just to make sure that this, continues and reaches a point whereby 2022, which is what we're aiming at now, we have in place a legislation that not only tackles safety, or at least that tackles safety in all its forms, including personal training. Brilliant.
And again, I think the fact that if, like I said, those that have been displaced because of practical sizing, if they're given the opportunity to upskill, cross-skill, and new skill, it's also going to help them with the anxiety and the mental health issues that people get when they're suddenly put out of work and they can't find it again. So I think it has many more benefits just than doing it because we care as an industry. So I think that's a great thing. Now, another point, Fabio, everybody always used to say, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, but cash now is reality. And as far as so much equipment and everybody having their own equipment stock, apart from some airports that entertained pooling like Luton, this option now of assessing whether or not equipment pooling makes sense to reduce your asset anchor. How do you feel about that? Do you think that has some benefits, some mileage?
I think it's a very it's certainly one of those, I would say, challenging questions for the future of this industry. I mean, equipment pooling has been at the core of our, debates for some years now. I'd say the following, and if I may, I would slightly digress in terms of sustainability of this business as well. We've seen, as I mentioned before, a number of state aid, supportive aids from governments to their airlines, mostly, sometimes to the airports, but almost nothing with respect to contractors and other elements of the ecosystem, perhaps with the exception of the aircraft manufacturers. But even there, it's, let's say, not ideal.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in many cases there was a debate within the society to say, is it really normal that we should pay for, the taxpayer should pay for the survival of an industry whose CO2 footprints is notoriously high? And shouldn't we condition taxpayer support to industries that can show they have made some efforts in terms of sustainability, unlike air transport, which is finger pointing as being 2.5% of the CO2 emissions, right? and notoriously known for not having any alternatives to the good old gasoline engines that are equipping the aircraft today. It's a fair question, honestly, and I think that the more things are going to go, and the more you will have these questions.
Yep.
Right? Should we really have this industry? Now, I mentioned that we are, fortunately, unfortunately, I would say at this stage, it's definitely unfortunately, we're not getting any state aid, with a few exceptions. But it's something that I think remains impressed in people's minds. Now, it is true that for us, with this race to the bottom, it's been always complicated to look beyond the 6-month time frame.
Yep.
Complicating for the industry to invest in longer term, equipments that would allow you to, go all electric, for instance. And not only because the electric, substitute vehicles compared to the diesel vehicles are more expensive, but also because you feel in the end, why do I need to do this? The airline doesn't care. It doesn't ask me to invest into that. So it would be an investment that I would make, and that would put me at a comparative disadvantage vis-a-vis my competitors who are using 20-year-old diesel machines, right?
Plus the airports, Fabio, don't have enough power in most cases to even offer it.
Well, but yes, you're right. But then the airports, they must have some sort of incentives from the governments to say, hey guys, you need to improve your CO2 footprints. So as a matter of fact, ACI has started, very smartly I must say, a program called the Carbon Accreditation Program back 9-10 years ago. But it's a voluntary program. So what you have is a very elaborate and sophisticated system whereby airports can calculate their emissions and try to compensate for them. But it's a voluntary scheme, and what you see is that mostly Northern European airports are faring pretty well, but that the vast majority of airports don't care, because they're not being told that this is important for them, right? And so if the airports don't feel they're obliged to mitigate their CO2 footprints, why would they require that their ground handlers or caterers or all the contractors, do similarly? But I think things are changing, as I said, and one of the aspects under which to look at your question of equipment pooling would be to say, hey, especially nowadays, forget about us investing in longer term equipments at a higher cost than the average diesel. We won't do this. However, if you do have, you airports, an incentive, and you should have one because you are governmental in most cases, entities or subsidiaries, then you should be able to do two things, either you review the way that you grant your licenses, and force your contractors to include gradually, of course, not overnight, but gradually elements of sustainability in them as being a way for these ground handlers, and others to get their license. Normally it's a 7-year license, can be more. Or you propose, as you said, equipment pooling that actually you as an airport invest into, and then you lease to the contractors that have gotten the license. So I think it's difficult for me to talk about this without having made this digression with respect to sustainability and CO2 footprints. But obviously, this equipment pooling goes beyond the mere CO2 question. It's more an approach, an alternative approach to how we have done this business. To be honest, I'm not sure that if we would go down this avenue, it would change much. It would change the systemic or the path of this business. I think it would just shift a little bit the issue of cutthroat competition and SLAs, punitive SLAs. I don't think it has the possibility of radically changing this industry. But if you're injecting this sustainability element, then I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, 100%. The sustainability issue is so important, and I think as we come out of this crisis that has taken the whole world by the throat, people have got to start to care more. And if they care more, then there needs to be a reboot across most industries, and there has to be a more realistic and practical approach. Because at the end of the day, you can't afford for the next 1 or 2 generations to have such a huge debt that they've got to pay back because of all these things that have happened. So it gives an opportunity to get rid of all that legacy waste and reboot and remodel everything for the future. Now, for that future, so many people are placing their bets on therapeutics, on vaccines, and Tiaka and Pharma Aero did a survey, and they came back with the points that it was a positive element that people were actually starting to approach it collectively, but there was a realistic element that the industry isn't ready enough to take on the challenge of vaccines if they come in the volumes that are expected. Have you got any opinion on that, Fabio?
I have a personal opinion. I'm not sure I would have an opinion from an ASA or an ACAS perspective, other than to say anything that may help restore this battered confidence of the traveler back to the airline would be welcome. So that would be for the official ASA and ACA point of view perspective. My own personal opinion on that, if you're interested, is that I think, and I'm certainly not one of these anti-vaccine people who are shouting that this is a government plot, on the internet or anything like this. It's true that it has both therapeutic elements and a let's say mental elements in that. When you feel you have been vaccinated against this, then obviously suddenly your confidence in going out and in redoing simple things in your life is boosted.
Yeah.
And so it's like a psychological boost, and hence it has a very interesting therapeutic effect per se. Honestly, I don't know where this is going. We've heard that this virus has mutated, and it has only a 9-month history, right? And so I'm wondering whether it makes a lot of sense to have a vaccine for one COVID-19 aspect, and then we will discover that 6 months after, this vaccine doesn't protect you from the mutations of this virus. So I would stop there, because I don't really know what I'm talking about. I'm not a doctor or anything. I'm just saying that it's true, this vaccine is being eagerly awaited by large elements and sections of this industry as a potential savior. And I would say, just a word of caution on that, I'm not sure it will fundamentally change, unfortunately, the habits of the passenger, the ones that we've seen in the last 9 months. I think it would be a mistake to believe that the coming up of a vaccine will suddenly solve all our problems.
Yeah, I tend to, I've sort of gone up and down, but I think now, the whole world has to learn to live with and not wait for. And because the waiting could go on for far too long. So, to live with is so important. Fabio, we're coming towards the end of the session. So what I'd just like to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, from your respective association leadership roles, what would you be willing to sort of put forward as a collaborative action that would help the supply chain? And what would you like to see coming from the supply chain that would help your membership? Just 1, 2, or 3 quick things on each side of the coin.
I think we should be pushing more within our membership in terms of understanding that this crisis will stay there for some time, and that we need to rethink the system.
Yeah.
Survival mode, yes, everyone is in survival mode. You're trying to keep the number of employees that you can in function of the volume, and the volume is super low, as we all know.
Yeah.
But I think this is not to be missed opportunity to think, hey, I mean, obviously we were in a dynamic, growing system before, but that blinded us with respect to a number of major flaws in the whole system that we didn't have to see because we were growing.
Yeah.
And I think now we ought to pause and say, okay, let's dedicate some time to how we can fix these fundamental flaws, some of which I mentioned before, right? So that would be one thing that I would really wish to, this crisis to help us do, right? Both for ACA and for ASA, by the way. I think it is valid what I'm saying for the whole value chain. It's not that some elements were doing absolutely right and others were not. I think we're part of the whole, and the whole is having a number of imbalances that were known, but we could, as I said, we could sort of put them aside because we didn't have to really look at them as long as things were growing.
Yeah.
And then perhaps an element that is perhaps a bit more personal, but it's interesting to see this industry, and I'm here speaking about both the ground handling industry and the catering industry, still doesn't see or consider itself as a fully integrated element of the air transport value chain. And that is perhaps due to the fact that for so long they've been a subsidiary of the airlines they belong to, right? And so they still see themselves through the prism of the airlines that they used to belong to, and not as a fully full elements of this complex ecosystem of our transports, and that sometimes is not helping themselves and their association achieve a number of ambitious targets that we normally, as an element of this ecosystem, should be able to reach. So, it's taking time, of course. They're not used to that, and perhaps after this crisis, we will see that some attitudes will change. But these would be the two elements that I would that come to mind, actually.
Very good. No, I think there's a lot of sense and a lot of logic there, and especially the fact that to pause now and reflect on what was blinding us because of grow, revenue and market share, to just reflect and work on how much of it was actually dragging down a decent margin. And at the end of the day, margins matter. And I think people now should start to focus on looking at the continuity, capability and sustainability of their business. And if it doesn't meet certain criteria, forget all these global agreements, because if one or two goes down, you're left in negative area, which is crazy. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I really like the fact that you personally and professionally are focused on your members and the continuing training and options and support of those that have been displaced. And as a result of that displacement, they're allowing the others to have a future. So we shouldn't forget them, and we should try and get them back as quick as possible.
Agree.
So Fabio, thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate it. It's been lovely to have a chat with you, and I look forward to speaking to you some more very, very soon. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the interesting and very focused questions. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Cheers.